Chapter 3. Russia. "Look, Nestrov," I said. "Look at the rich black soil we're passing now. There's no end to it." Then suddenly I cried, "Look at the signpost we just passed. It's the border of Russia." I leapt up off the wooden planks of the boxcars and cried to everyone inside, "We're in Russia!" Immediately everyone in the freight car was up, crowding at the entrance, peering out through the slats in the side of the car, looking back at the signpost that was already getting smaller and smaller as the train plowed slowly ahead. Despite the cramped wooden quarters of the car, everyone's spirits soared, their faces lit up. They slapped one another on the back, someone started to sing. But I fell silent, looking out at the rich soil of Russia for the first time, extremely moved. After a while, I turned to Father Nestrov and said quietly, "What did I tell you? Russia in the spring." And then I added, almost as an afterthought, "Today is the 19th of March, the feast of St. Joseph, the worker." Nestrov and I looked at each other for a long moment in silence. There was no way of knowing what the future would bring, but we were at last doing what we had dreamed so many years of doing, what we had discussed so often during our student days in Rome, what we had planned so carefully during the past months in Lvov. It didn't matter if no one else in that boxcar knew we were priests. We knew it. To them, I was Vladimir Lipinski, a Pole whose family had been wiped out in a German air raid. Crossing the Russian border gave me a strange sense of exhilaration and yet of loneliness, of a beginning and an end. Even the land itself seemed different, the vast sweep of Ukraine with seemingly unlimited stretches of cultivated land rising at times to gently rolling hills and pasture land. The enthusiasm of the others in the car was infectious, a combination of many causes. For one thing, it meant that we were nearing the end of our trip in the rough-hewn confines of boxcar 89725. There had been 25 of us in the car when the trip started, but other workers had been piled in at stops along the way. The car had 2 rows of rough plank bunks along the wall, straw on the floor, and a ventilator at the top of the car. The only other furnishings were an old punctured oil drum that served as a stove and a slop bucket to serve as a toilet. We'd been hired by Lesbromhaus, a big Soviet lumber combine that was hiring men for work in the Ural regions. They were anxious to get cheap labor, especially refugees, from lands newly occupied by the Red Army. Few questions were asked. The great majority of the people in our car were Jews who had fled before the Nazi advance into Poland. Whole families were on the train, grandfather, grandmother, father, mother, and children. Uprooted after generations, they were carrying everything they owned on their backs, like refugees everywhere, to a new life in an alien land. They talked for hours during the jolting stop-and-go trip that took better than 2 weeks, of the homes they had left and their new hopes. Together we talked about the opportunities that lay ahead of us in the Urals. For all of us, therefore, crossing the border into Russia had a special meaning. For Father Nestrov and me, it was the fulfillment of a dream. For Frank, a Warsaw Jew with whom Nestrov and I had become quite friendly on the trip, it was also the fulfillment of a dream. He was a communist who had fled from Warsaw just before it fell to the Germans. He had determined then to take his family, his wife, his 10-year-old son, and his nephew, to live in that paradise he had read so much about in communist literature. Each of the others in the car undoubtedly had reasons of his own for the joy that swept over us all in crossing the border into Russia. For my part, I will never forget that feeling. It was a mixture of natural elation at having reached a goal, coupled with a deep interior peace and joy. Enthusiasm and hope mingled with the sudden realization that I would now be cut off completely from the supports that I had known, from my Jesuit superiors and colleagues, from my family, from the visible church, from the power of the U.S. government to protect me in case of serious trouble. For a moment I thought with sorrow and regret about the possibility of never returning to Europe, to the United States, to Shenandoah. Yet the strong realization rushed over me that I was not cut off from God, that He was with me. Indeed, that I was dependent only on Him in a new and very real way. My spirits soared. My heart beat a little faster with happiness at this realization as I joined in the general celebration in that boxcar for special reasons of my own. Our arrival in the Ural lumber towns of Chusovoy and Teplaya Gora soon ended our euphoria. It was raining when we arrived, bone-weary and long since out of the food and provisions we had taken for the trip. Starving, we had to stand in the rain while a Lesbromhaus representative checked us out and then slogged through the mud to a camp a mile outside the city. At the camp, the barracks were new and raw. Large sections in the walls where the timbers had warped were stuffed with mud and plastered like stucco. The work we were assigned was rough. In mixed brigades of men and women, we hauled logs from the river and stacked them in rows over 6 feet high and some 30 yards in length. The pay was bad to start with, and it depended upon how many cubic meters of logs you stacked in a day. Newcomers obviously were not very good at the work and so earned very little. Nestrov and I, for example, pooled our salaries for food, but sometimes had only enough to buy a loaf of rye bread. There were nights we couldn't even afford that, since we had also had to pay for our lodging in the barracks, and that was deducted before we even saw our paycheck. Our friend Frank, with his dreams of a worker's paradise, was stunned by it all. Father Nestrov and I were equally disappointed, not by the physical labor, exhausting as it was, or the constant discomfort, the wretched housing, the lack of privacy, or the gnawing hunger. All these were difficult enough to bear, but we would have endured them gladly if we could have achieved our purpose for coming to Russia. The rudest awakening of all, however, was our growing realization that we might have no apostolate at all here. Though freedom of religion is technically guaranteed by the Soviet Constitution, proselytization is strictly forbidden. The Constitution guarantees freedom of atheist propaganda, but those who try to spread the truths of the faith or foster religion are in fact breaking the law. Nestrov and I had known this, of course, simply as a matter of pure fact. Now we began to experience it as a fact of daily life. Nobody wanted to talk about religion, let alone practice it. Though none of the workers in our barracks knew that Nestrov and I were priests, they were still reluctant to so much as discuss any matters dealing with God or religion. We were accepted among them as fellow workers, in an easy spirit of comradeship. We shared the work, the poor food, the poor housing, the daily hardships. The refugees especially were a simple people with a difficult lot in life that they accepted with resignation. They welcomed us in their company, conversed freely, and answered practical problems with the cliches and bromides born of common hardships or cultural heritage. But they would not speak of God or hear of God. They were afraid. Nestrov and I, too, became cautious and even fearful. You couldn't help it in that atmosphere. We were afraid not only for ourselves and for what we still hoped might prove the ultimate success of our apostolate, but for the people among whom we had hoped to minister as well. They had so little in this life that we did not want to be the cause of further trouble for them. We knew, and they knew, there were informers and party members who would report any religious activities. It was even necessary not to say anything to the children about God, tempting as such a thought might be, lest they, in all innocence, tell others about our conversation and so give it away. We had hoped, when we made our plans to come to Russia, that we could begin our apostolate by ministering to the refugees, many of whom would be Polish Catholics, and then gradually widen our influence to serve the believers still in Russia. Instead, we found we could not even bring up the subject of religion with our fellow workers, whether refugees or native Russians, let alone tell them we were priests. And as this realization dawned, our disappointment grew. Because our hopes had been so high, our enthusiasm so great, our disappointment at being unable to initiate any type of apostolate at all was just that much greater. Disappointment gradually gave way to a feeling of disillusionment and depression. There were even times when I took pity on myself and thought harshly about my fellow workers. I had given up so much, sacrificed so much, risked so much in order to bring Christ to them, and would they not even talk to me about such things? We will never get anywhere here, I sometimes said to Father Nestrov, because the people are so full of fear. They would even hesitate to take the risk of having children baptized in secret or of receiving the sacraments secretly. Yet these were the people I had come to serve, the people who were deprived of all means of worshiping God. I wanted to suffer with them and for them, if only they were willing to accept me, not as a fellow worker, but as a priest. At other times I felt humiliated. The zeal of the communists, I thought, put me to shame, and that they were effective there could be no doubt. Indeed, it was their very effectiveness that made me feel, as a priest, alien among my own people. I had come to serve, and I could not serve, because no one would listen to me. What could Nestrov and I do against the power of this system? The notion that we could ever effectively work in this country under these circumstances seemed in retrospect nothing but a pipe dream. We had entered upon what we thought was a great missionary endeavor, full of zeal and enthusiasm, only to come smack up against reality. Things here were not at all as we had envisioned them, and we were not at all equipped to face things as we found them. So much for our hopes, our expectations, our dreams, our convictions, above all, our enthusiasm. Tortured by these questions and these doubts, Nestrov and I were sorely tempted to find some way to leave Russia and return to Poland, where we could at least act as priests again, even if with difficulty in an occupied country. The people there surely needed us in times of persecution. The people there would come to us if they knew we were available. We could serve the church there. We could do nothing here. This whole Russian venture seemed now to have been a mistake, an ill-conceived missionary effort based on hopes and dreams rather than on hard facts, a plan born of insufficient information and misinformation. That was the temptation that Father Nestrov and I faced at Teplaya Gora, and though our situation may have been somewhat unique, the temptation itself was not. It is the same temptation faced by everyone who has followed a call and found that the realities of life were nothing like the expectations he had in the first flush of his vision and his enthusiasm. It is the temptation that comes to anyone, for example, who has entered religious life with a burning desire to serve God and Him alone, only to find that the day-to-day life in religion is humdrum and pedestrian, equally as filled with moments of human misunderstanding, daily routines, and distractions as the secular life he left behind in the world. It is the same temptation faced by young couples in marriage when the honeymoon is over and they must face a seemingly endless future of living together and scratching out an existence in the same old place and the same old way. It is the temptation to say, "This life is not what I thought it would be. This is not what I bargained for. It is not at all what I wanted either. If I had known it would be like this, I would never have made this choice. I would never have made this promise. You must forgive me, God, but I want to go back. You cannot hold me to a promise made in ignorance. You cannot expect me to keep a covenant based on faith without any previous knowledge of the true facts of life. It is not fair. I never thought it would be like this. I simply cannot stand it, and I will not stay. I will not serve." It is a temptation that comes to every man and woman, sometimes daily. That it should come to Nestrov and me in the terrible surroundings of Teplaya Gora is not surprising in retrospect, and yet we almost gave in to it. We spoke of finding ways to return to Lvov. We argued that it was only right to report to our superiors, that we should tell them of the true circumstances in the Urals before any more men were sent on such a mission. We continued our work in the lumber camps, looking always for a chance to leave, and resorted to prayer to sustain us in the meantime. Our one spiritual consolation was the Mass. Occasionally, we were able to get away, just the two of us, into the forest, and there celebrate a Mass in secret. We wore no vestments, the stump of a tree served as our altar, and we had to be constantly on guard against discovery. In some ways, this need for secrecy in celebrating the sacrifice of the Mass only served to emphasize the difficulties we had encountered, the near impossibility of ever doing what we had come to do for the people to whom we had hoped to minister. Yet the Mass gave us strength. We preached little homilies after the Gospel, first Father Nestrov and then I. It was amazing how impressive the Gospel message could be in such circumstances. Our spirits would seem to drink in the words, savor them, and feel the divine power in them. And at the moment of consecration, God became present in a new way at Teplaya Gora. He was there, in answer to our petitions, where the sacrifice of Calvary had never been celebrated before. In that sacrament, we could offer up all our sacrifices with His, could ask His blessing on those for whom we labored and prayed in secret, for those who themselves were perhaps praying in secret, but who couldn't worship Him publicly. Those were my most consoling thoughts, my happiest moments in what had turned out to be almost a non-apostolate at Teplaya Gora. The consolation of that sacrifice, that offering, would stay with me as we returned home through the darkness and silence of the forest. And then one day, together, it dawned on us. God granted us the grace to see the solution to our dilemma, the answer to our temptation. It was the grace, quite simply, to look at our situation from His viewpoint rather than from ours. It was the grace not to judge our efforts by human standards or by what we ourselves wanted or expected to happen, but rather according to God's design. It was the grace to understand that our dilemma, our temptation, was of our own making and existed only in our minds. It did not and could not coincide with the real world ordained by God and governed ultimately by His will. Saint Ignatius puts it starkly and forthrightly in his first principle and foundation. Man is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save his soul. The other things on the face of the earth are created for man to help him in attaining the end for which he is created. Hence, man is to make use of them insofar as they help him in the attainment of his end, and he must rid himself of them insofar as they prove a hindrance to him. Therefore, we must make ourselves indifferent to all created things. Ignatius calls that the principle and foundation of his spiritual exercises. But it is also the most fundamental truth of man's existence and God's providence. Those 4 sentences put it as plainly and simply as it can be put. How often had Nestrov and I heard those words, read those statements, prayed and meditated over them, and yet under the pressure of circumstances at Teplaya Gora, we had forgotten them. We had accepted them as abstract principles of the spiritual life, but they had not become part of our daily lives. At least they had not so far been operative in our approach to life and our dilemma at Teplaya Gora. If they had been, we would have understood much earlier that our sole purpose at Teplaya Gora, as indeed in our whole lives, was to do the will of God. Not the will of God as we might wish it, or as we might have envisioned it, or as we thought in our poor human wisdom it ought to be, but rather the will of God as God envisioned it, and revealed it to us each day in the created situations with which he presented us. His will for us was the 24 hours of each day, the people, the places, the circumstances he set before us in that time. Those were the things that God knew were important to him and to us at that moment, and those were the things upon which he wanted us to act, not out of any abstract principle or out of any subjective desire to do the will of God. No, these things, the 24 hours of this day, were his will. We had to learn to recognize his will in the reality of the situation and to act accordingly. We had to learn to look at our daily lives, at everything that crossed our paths each day, with the eyes of God. Learn to see his estimate of things and places, and above all, people. Recognize that he had a goal and a purpose in bringing us into contact with these things and these people, and strive always to do that will, his will, every hour of every day in the situations in which he had placed us. For to what other purpose had we been created? For what other reason had he so arranged it that we should be here, now, this hour, among these people? To what other end had he ordained our being here, if not to see his will in these situations, and to strive to do always what he wanted, the way he wanted, as he would have done it, for his sake, that he might have the fruit and the glory? Our dilemma at Teplaya Gora came from our frustration at not being able to do what we thought the will of God ought to be in this situation, at our inability to work as we thought God would surely want us to work, instead of accepting the situation itself as his will. It is a mistake easily made by every man, saint or scholar, church leader or day laborer. Ultimately, we come to expect God to accept our understanding of what his will ought to be, and to help us fulfill that, instead of learning to see and accept his will in the real situations in which he places us daily. The simple soul who each day makes a morning offering of all the prayers, works, joys, and sufferings of this day, and who then acts upon it by accepting unquestionably and responding lovingly to all the situations of the day as truly sent by God, has perceived with an almost childlike faith the profound truth about the will of God. To predict what God's will is going to be, to rationalize about what his will must be, is at once a work of human folly and yet the subtlest of all temptations. The plain and simple truth is that his will is what he actually wills to send us each day, in the way of circumstances, places, people, and problems. The trick is to learn to see that not just in theory, or not just occasionally in a flash of insight granted by God's grace, but every day. Each of us has no need to wonder about what God's will must be for us. His will for us is clearly revealed in every situation of every day, if only we could learn to view all things as he sees them and sends them to us. The temptation is to overlook these things as God's will. The temptation is to look beyond these things, precisely because they are so constant, so petty, so humdrum and routine, and to seek to discover instead some other and nobler will of God in the abstract that better fits our notion of what his will should be. And that was our temptation at Teplaya Gora. Just as it is the temptation faced by everyone who suddenly discovers that life is not what he expected it to be. The answer lies in understanding that it is these things, and these things alone, here and now, at this moment, that truly constitute the will of God. The challenge lies in learning to accept this truth and act upon it every moment of every day. The trouble is that, like all great truths, it seems too simple. It is there before our noses all the time, while we look elsewhere for more subtle answers. It bears the hallmark of all divine truths, simplicity. And yet it is precisely because it seems so simple that we are prone to overlook it or ignore it in our daily lives. Like every divine truth, moreover, it is far from simple of execution. Its very simplicity renders it at once almost impossible not just of credibility, but of human achievement, for our poor human nature is too easily distracted. The very circumstances of our lives, so constant and so humdrum and routine, and yet the things that truly constitute the will of God for us each day, are also the very things that serve so to distract us, precisely because we are so involved in them, and cause us to lose sight, however momentarily, of this great truth. And yet to grasp this divine truth, simple as it sounds, and work at it, to face each moment of every day in the light of its inspiration, to attempt, in so far as we can, to recall it in every situation and circumstance of our daily lives, to labor day in and day out to make it the sole principle by which our every action is guided and toward which we aim, is to come to know at last true joy and peace of heart, secure in the knowledge we are attempting always and in everything to do God's will, the only purpose ultimately for which we exist, the end for which alone we were created. There is no greater security a man could ask, no greater serenity a man can know.